His voice was steady, almost bored, when he told me I was done. One unsigned expense report, he said, proved I wasn't aligned with company values. I walked out carrying nothing but my coat, and a silence that felt sharper than any insult. What he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that the moment they pushed me out, they severed the one thread holding their entire operation together. And that thread was mine. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. For nearly a decade, I was the person everyone depended on, but no one truly saw. While executives chased promotions and consultants delivered glossy slide decks, I was the one who kept Solara DataWorks standing upright. Every overnight failure, every customer-facing glitch, every crisis that threatened to derail a launch eventually ended up in my hands, usually at 2 or 3 in the morning. I didn't complain, not because I lacked a voice, but because stability mattered more to me than recognition. My reward was knowing the systems ran, the clients were satisfied, and the company stayed alive even when leadership made decisions that should have sunk us years earlier. Solara liked to pretend it was a sleek, forward-thinking tech darling perched on Seattle's waterfront. But behind the polished glass and the carefully worded press releases lived a tangled, aging infrastructure patched together by necessity and stubborn dedication. I understood its weaknesses better than anyone. I knew which services would collapse if you breathed on them wrong, which processes required gentle handling, which back-end tasks needed coaxing to stay functional under load. I knew because I had built the workarounds, the safety nets, the invisible solutions nobody else bothered to understand. New managers came and went. Some tried to reorganize, some tried to leave their mark, some simply sat in meetings reporting success I had delivered for them. The only constant was me. Yet even with all that knowledge, all that history, people rarely asked how I kept everything running. They were comfortable assuming things just worked, as if systems maintained themselves and servers respected quarterly budgets. It wasn't malice, it was convenience. As long as I quietly absorbed the chaos, they never had to face what it truly took to keep Solara afloat. I thought I could endure that invisibility forever. I thought it was enough to be indispensable, even if nobody acknowledged it. But I started to notice small shifts, the kinds of changes employees recognize long before leadership thinks they're obvious. Meetings suddenly became centered around modernization initiatives. Slide decks popped up filled with words like synergy, velocity, optimization. A new emphasis on appearances overshadowed the importance of functioning systems. Someone somewhere had decided form mattered more than substance, and that mindset is always the beginning of a downfall. When Mason Trent walked in as our new CTO, the shift accelerated. People whispered that he'd been hired for his vision, which seemed to mean he wore good suits, spoke with rehearsed confidence, and had a resume polished by prestigious but shallow wins. He didn't ask me about the architecture, the dependencies, or the fragile balance I'd spent years maintaining. He asked where my documentation lived. He asked why I had designed certain safeguards the way I did, the kind of questions people ask only when they intend to dismantle things they don't understand. At first, I told myself it was fine. I'd survived executives like him before. They came in thinking they'd reinvent everything, only to learn that reality didn't bend to their PowerPoints. But there was an air about Mason, a calculated indifference, a need to assert dominance that made every instinct in me sharpen. Something was coming, something deliberate, and for the first time in 9 years, I felt the first flicker of fear that the stability I had built might finally be tested. Not by failure, but by arrogance. The morning it happened didn't feel any different from the hundreds before it. Seattle's mist clung low over the waterfront, and from my desk on the 15th floor, I watched the ferries cut slow, gray lines across Elliott Bay, while Solara's systems ran with their usual quiet obedience. I was reviewing routine diagnostics when Mason appeared behind me, not walking up, not announcing himself, just suddenly there, looming in a way that made the hair on my arms lift. He held a printout in his hand, crisp and deliberate, as if even the paper knew it was meant to intimidate. "We need to discuss this," he said, tapping the page. No greeting, no context. I glanced at the number circled in red, $620. It was a subscription charge for a diagnostics tool I had used repeatedly when our internal systems failed to detect anomalies. Procurement had stalled approval for nearly 2 months, and I had reached for my own card because another outage would have cost far more than $600. It prevented 3 failures last quarter, I said, calm, factual. I submitted the reimbursement and documented everything. It was denied, he replied without looking at me. And since you purchased it without authorization, it now constitutes a policy violation. The word violation hung in the air like poison. Mason, you know why I needed that tool. Our internal monitors weren't catching the early stage degradation, and if I hadn't used it... He cut me off with a small, satisfied breath. This isn't about performance, it's about alignment. You've been operating independently for years without oversight, and that's not how modern teams function. Solara needs standardization, not rogue solutions. Rogue, an interesting word for something that had kept his job easier than he would ever know. If the issue is the approval workflow, I'm happy to... No, he said, folding the paper neatly as if sealing the decision. This is a pattern. You've grown too comfortable, too autonomous. We're moving forward without you, effective immediately. I stared at him, not because I didn't understand, but because I did. This wasn't about $620. This was about power, his need to assert it, my refusal to shrink under it. Security will escort you out, he added, almost gently, as if courtesy softened cruelty. Within minutes, 2 guards approached, polite but firm, the kind of men who apologized with their eyes but followed orders with their feet. I handed over my badge, my laptop, my access token. The objects that had connected me to 9 years of sleepless nights and impossible saves felt strangely weightless as they left my hands. Employees glanced up from their desks as I passed through the open floor, eyes lingering a second too long before darting away. No one spoke, though one of the interns looked like she might cry. That nearly broke me. At the elevator, one of the guards murmured, "Sorry about this." I managed a small nod. The descent felt endless, each floor sliding past like a piece of my life quietly detaching. When the doors opened to the lobby, the air felt colder, cleaner, like the building itself was already wiping away any trace of me. Outside, the mist had thickened into something closer to fog, the kind that blurs edges and makes even familiar streets feel distant. For a moment, I stood motionless on the sidewalk, the termination packet heavy in my hand, my mind silent in that stunned, suspended way people describe right before a storm hits. Fired over $620, not for incompetence, not for misconduct, for daring to take responsibility when others stalled, for refusing to let the company sink while paperwork shuffled. But underneath the shock, a quiet realization began to surface. Slow, steady, undeniable. Mason believed he had removed me cleanly, surgically, without consequence. He believed the systems would keep humming without the person who'd kept their heart beating for years. He had no idea what he'd just undone, no idea what he had just set in motion. I didn't go home right away. I walked for nearly an hour along the waterfront, letting the cold air cut through the shock still tightening around my ribs. At some point, my feet carried me into a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a bike shop, a place I'd visited years ago during an outage that kept me awake for 36 hours straight. It felt fitting to return there now. I ordered a coffee I barely tasted and stared at the steam curling from the cup until my mind finally unlocked from its stunned paralysis. Fired over $620, humiliated, escorted out like a liability instead of the person who had prevented the company from collapsing more times than I could count. But beneath the residual ache, something sharper began to take shape. A memory, a pattern, a truth I had always known but never needed to act on. Solara hadn't owned half the things it depended on. I had, not in a petty vindictive way, in a purely factual one. For years I had worked nights and weekends on methods, tools, and processes when Solara didn't have the budget or foresight to build them internally. I used my own equipment, my own time, and in some cases my own licensing frameworks. My employment agreement had allowed personal projects as long as they weren't developed with company resources. Mine hadn't been. And because I am meticulous, because being a woman in tech means you don't get the luxury of sloppiness, I documented everything, every date, every device, every instance of integration they later adopted because it made their systems more stable. They had treated my work as a bottomless well. They never asked who built it, when it was built, or under what terms. They simply consumed it because it made their jobs easier. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and tapped the name I hadn't used since law school, Erica Vaughn. If Mason thought arrogance was a strategy, he had never sat across from Erica during contract negotiations. "Camila," she answered, confusion bleeding into concern. "Are you okay?" "I was fired this morning," I said. "I need to see you." "Now." "Now." She didn't hesitate. "Come to my office. I'll clear the afternoon." 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from her in a corner office high above Pioneer Square. Erica listened without interrupting as I told her everything: the $620 subscription, the accusation, the immediate termination. When I finished, she leaned back, eyes narrowed. "Absurd. Not illegal, but absurd." "That's not why I'm here," I said quietly. I opened my laptop, my personal one, and navigated to the repositories only I had access to. One by one, I showed her the timestamps, the device logs, the development diaries. Then I opened a usage dashboard Solera didn't know existed, a passive tracker integrated years ago to help me monitor how their systems interacted with my methods. When she saw the volume of commercial activity, years of it, her eyebrows rose. "Camila, this is substantial." "They never licensed any of it," I said. "They never asked to. They just used it." "And you have proof these were developed outside your employment scope?" "Yes." She tapped her pen against the desk, a habit she had when calculating something enormous. "Do you understand what this means?" I nodded. "I do now." "What's your goal?" she asked. "Revenge? Money? Closure?" I shook my head. "Recognition, respect, and consequences." Erica smiled slowly, the kind of smile that says the wheels have already begun turning. "Then you came to the right person." And in that moment, everything shifted. A few hours earlier, Mason thought he had ended my relevance with a printed sheet of paper and a security escort, but he had forgotten one fundamental rule of engineering. Remove one crucial component, and the entire structure reveals what it can't live without. Solara was about to learn that lesson the hard way. That night, after leaving Erica's office with a folder full of possibilities and a mind humming with clarity, I went back to my loft overlooking Lake Union. I set my bag on the counter, watered the little jade plant I'd carried out of Solara in my arms, and opened my personal dashboard, the one no one at the company ever knew existed. It wasn't spyware, nothing unethical. It was simply a monitoring tool I'd built years ago so I could understand how my own methods behaved in real environments. Solara had benefited from that insight for 9 years without ever thanking me for it. Now it was about to tell me exactly how fast they were syncing. At first, the screen looked normal. The system interactions were steady, calling my processes the way they always had. Even the load balancing algorithms I'd created were doing their job without complaint. But shortly after midnight, a flicker appeared, an anomaly, then another. By morning, the patterns had shifted noticeably. Someone had changed a dependency. Someone inexperienced. Someone who thought my messy logic could be replaced with a cleaner, simpler shortcut. I knew the signature. I'd seen it in Mason's early attempts to modernize things before understanding why they were built that way. By noon the following day, the errors multiplied. A memory loop in their customer analytics workflow. A failing validation check in sales reporting. Nothing catastrophic yet, just the kind of cracks I used to catch and patch before they spread. Without those silent interventions, the cracks deepened. Late that afternoon, my former colleague Jonah texted me from an unknown number. "Are you seeing this?" I didn't reply, but I refreshed my dashboard. CPU spikes, slowdowns, retries, a stalled overnight job. I imagined the scene in the 15th floor operations room, engineers huddled in confusion, dashboards lit up in a rainbow of warnings, managers panicking because none of them understood where the problems were coming from. I had spent 9 years preventing exactly these days from happening. 9 years absorbing the chaos before it reached them. Now they were meeting chaos face to face, and it was only the beginning. 2 days later, Twitter lit up. Solara data outage? Anyone else seeing delays in Solara's reporting tools? Their whole system feels sluggish today. I sat on my balcony with a mug of tea, watching the news ripple outward like waves hitting the shore. Erica called around noon. Looks like they're struggling. They introduced instability, I said. My workarounds were removed. Convenient timing, she replied dryly. Coincidental, I said. Predictable, she corrected. She wasn't wrong. That evening, the first real failure hit. An entire client reporting batch froze mid-cycle, throwing off time-sensitive financial summaries for one of Solara's largest enterprise partners. I watched their attempts to restart the job, then their attempts to roll it back, then their frantic attempts to bypass it completely. None worked. My method handled that workflow originally. Without it, nothing aligned. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Jonah. It's bad. Worse than they're saying. They're trying to manually reroute things. Manual rerouting, the corporate equivalent of duct tape on a sinking ship. The next morning, another crack split open, this time during a data migration cycle. Anyone with experience in large-scale systems knows migrations are delicate, especially when the architecture has grown organically, stitched together by necessity rather than elegance. Mine had made it survivable. Without mine, it became a minefield. Dependencies misfired, schema validations failed. A deadlock formed between two critical datasets, grinding the entire process to a halt. They were stuck, completely. The stock dipped 3% by close of market. News articles speculated about internal restructuring challenges. Solara stayed silent. I watched it all unfold with a calm so steady it surprised even me. Not because I enjoyed their suffering, there were good people still inside, but because this was the natural consequence of Mason believing systems run on arrogance alone. Late that night, as I sat reading by the window, another text arrived from Jonah. Leadership is losing it. Mason is blaming everyone except himself. They're trying to untangle things, but every fix breaks something else. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth was unmistakable. The foundation they dismissed as expendable was revealing just how irreplaceable it had been all along. And if Erica was right, the moment to act, the moment to finally hold them accountable, was approaching faster than anyone inside Solara realized. By the end of the week, Solara's unraveling had turned into something impossible to hide. Their biggest clients were demanding answers. The executive team had fallen into a rotation of emergency meetings, and Mason, according to a message from Lila in finance, had spent an entire afternoon pacing the hallway, snapping at anyone who crossed his path. That was the moment Erica decided we were ready. I met her at her office early Monday morning. She slid a draft letter across the table, crisp and elegant in its precision. "This isn't a threat," she said. "It's an invoice." It was an invoice for $5.8 million in unpaid commercial usage of my methods, tools, and processes. 4 years' worth, calculated conservatively, fully documented. When she emailed it to Solara's legal team at exactly 9:00 a.m., I felt nothing dramatic, no triumph, no vindictive thrill. Just a quiet, grounded certainty that a IG balance long overdue had finally been called. It took less than 40 minutes for my phone to ring. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was Solara's. "Camila," the voice snapped the moment I answered. "This is Mason. We need to discuss the outrageous claim your lawyer sent." "Then you should speak to my lawyer," I said. "That's what lawyers are for." "Don't play games," he said, trying for authority but landing somewhere closer to desperation. "This is absurd. You developed those systems while employed at Solara." "No," I said, steady and unyielding. "I developed them in my apartment, on my own hardware during my own time. Because Solara never invested in solutions. I simply allowed the company to integrate them. That doesn't transfer ownership. Silence crackled on the line. Then, we're not paying this, we will fight it. Then you should prepare, I replied, because using my work without a license violates commercial use terms, and the longer you keep using it, the more that number grows. Camila, he said sharply, be reasonable. Reason, I said, would have approved a $620 reimbursement instead of firing the person who kept your systems alive. I hung up. Erica and I watched together as the next wave of reactions rippled outward. The legal team scrambling, the board requesting emergency documentation, engineers digging frantically through old commit logs, trying to disprove what was already airtight. Then something happened that neither Solara nor Mason anticipated. A junior engineer accidentally pushed internal architecture diagrams to a public repository, diagrams that plainly showed how deeply intertwined my methods were with Solara's operations. Twitter pounced, LinkedIn lit up. Tech journalists began speculating on intellectual property violations and leadership incompetence. By afternoon, Solara's stock had fallen another 5%. Competitors began circling like sharks. I received 6 licensing inquiries, 3 interview requests, and 1 acquisition feeler within hours. Erica watched my inbox fill and murmured, "This is leverage you couldn't buy." The next morning, Solara's legal team emailed a 12-paragraph rebuttal claiming my work fell under work for hire. Erica sent back a folder of timestamp evidence so overwhelming it could have crushed concrete. Late that night, another call came, this time from an unfamiliar extension. "Camila," the voice said, brittle at the edges, "this is Brent Collins, Solara's general counsel. The board would like to speak with you." "Then have them speak to my lawyer," I answered. "I don't negotiate directly." He hesitated. "There's concern this could escalate further." "It will," I said simply, "if you continue pretending you own what you never built." When I hung up, I felt it. The first tremor of the power shift. Solara had thought firing me erased the problem. Instead, it had exposed exactly how unprepared they were to live without me. And they hadn't yet realized just how much deeper the consequences would go. 3 days after the invoice was delivered, Solara's silence finally cracked. Erica forwarded me an email late Thursday night, a terse message from the board requesting an immediate meeting to explore resolution pathways. In corporate language, that meant panic had officially replaced denial. We scheduled the meeting for the following Wednesday. That gave me nearly a week to prepare, not for war, but for the shift in gravity I knew was coming. On the morning of the meeting, I walked into Solara's tower not as an employee, not as a dismissed nuisance, but as someone they now needed, desperately. The receptionist looked startled when she saw me, recognition flickering across her expression, followed by something almost like sympathy. "They're expecting you," she said quietly. A security badge printed just for the occasion slid across the desk. I didn't miss the irony. Upstairs, a long conference table waited, surrounded by faces I'd only ever seen during annual all-hands meetings. Board members, representatives from legal, and at the far end, Solara's CEO who had dialed in from San Francisco, his voice crackling through the speaker as he greeted us. But the most striking absence was Mason. His chair sat empty. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. The board chair began with a practiced smile. "Camila, thank you for meeting with us. We believe this situation has escalated beyond what anyone intended." "It escalated," I said evenly, "because Solara used my work without permission for years and terminated me for trying to keep your systems functional." No one argued. Instead, the interim CTO, Talia, someone who actually understood the architecture, leaned forward. "We've reviewed everything," she said. "Your development logs, the timestamps, the integration history. There's no question the work originated outside Solara. We need to find a way to move forward." The CEO's voice buzzed through the speaker. "We are prepared to settle the outstanding amount." It wasn't an apology, but it was the first step toward an admission they could no longer pretend this wasn't real. And He continued. We would like to negotiate an ongoing licensing agreement. There it was. The moment the entire building had been tiptoeing around. Solara couldn't function without my work. Removing it had triggered cascading failures. Replacing it had proven impossible. They didn't just owe me for the past. They needed me for the future. Before we discuss terms, I said, I need clarity on something. Has there been a leadership change? Talia glanced at the empty chair. The board chair folded her hands. Mason resigned yesterday. Resigned, corporate shorthand for pushed out. I felt no satisfaction, only a quiet acknowledgement that consequences had caught up to the person who dismissed me with a smirk and a security escort. All right, I said, here's what I require. The room stilled. I outlined the essentials. Payment in full, legal fees covered, and a 7-year commercial license with annual renewal fees. Then I added one final condition, a public statement acknowledging that systems like Solara's are built on the innovation of engineers, and that terminating someone over a small expense had been a grave mistake. The board exchanged glances, not with resistance but with resignation. They knew they were in no position to negotiate downward. The CEO spoke again. We can agree to those terms. I nodded once. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was balance finally restored. Solara had believed they could discard me over $620. Now they were signing a contract worth more than their pride had ever allowed them to imagine. And the power they once took from me was now entirely, undeniably mine. In the weeks after the agreement was signed, my life shifted so quickly it felt like stepping out of a storm and realizing the sky had always been blue behind it. Solara wired the settlement and licensing payments exactly on schedule, their lawyers suddenly meticulous about every deadline, after years of ignoring the invisible labor that kept their systems breathing. The day the funds cleared, I didn't celebrate. I sat quietly in my living room, sunlight warming the hardwood floors, and let the truth settle. I no longer belonged to any company's panic cycle or broken hierarchy. I finally belonged to myself. With Erica's guidance, I launched a consultancy dedicated to safeguarding independent engineers, freelancers, and system architects. People like me who built quietly in the margins until someone tried to claim their work as corporate property. The first clients came fast, not because I marketed aggressively, but because the story spread. Engineers whispered it to one another during late-night deployments. Executives analyzed it in leadership seminars, and risk officers used it as a cautionary tale. Soon, I was reviewing contracts for startups, guiding senior developers on licensing strategy, and teaching teams how to protect their intellectual contributions before they vanished into someone else's roadmap. My methods, the ones Solara underestimated, became a core offering. Companies license them properly now, paying for the stability they once assumed they deserved for free. It felt strange at first to open invoices addressed to my own LLC instead of fixing failures for people who never knew my name. But the more I worked, the more I realized this was the career I'd been writing in the margins of my life for years without recognizing it. One afternoon, while finalizing a training module for a new client, a notification appeared on my screen. A message from an engineer I'd helped through a thorny ownership dispute. Your guidance changed everything, she wrote. I didn't know I had rights until you showed me where to look. I stared at the message longer than necessary, struck by the quiet impact behind her words. I had set out to reclaim my dignity, my work, my freedom. I hadn't expected that doing so would light a path for others. Months passed. Seattle moved from winter gray to spring brightness. My jade plant thrived on the windowsill, bigger now than when I carried it out of Solara's doors, its new shoots reaching for light it had never known inside that building. One evening, while walking along Lake Union, I saw Solara's tower reflected in the water. Their new CEO had issued the public statement I required, an acknowledgement of engineering labor, of the cost of underestimating the people who hold everything together. Some called it corporate repentance. I called it overdue. Did I feel victorious? Maybe, but more than that, I felt released. They no longer occupied space in my mind. Their failures were lessons for them, not anchors for me. I had built something larger than revenge, a life that existed because I chose myself instead of shrinking under someone else's arrogance. The world feels different when you know your worth and refuse to negotiate it. If Solara taught me anything, it's that people will take whatever you sacrifice: time, skill, loyalty, until you finally decide the price is yours to name. And I've learned to name mine. Now, when I turn off the lights in my office each night, I feel something I rarely felt during my 9 years at Solara: peace. The systems I manage are my own. The clients I serve respect the work. And the freedom I fought for, the freedom they tried to take for $620, is a debt they paid back 100 times over. I didn't understand the strength of quiet preparation until everything I'd built was tossed aside over a $620 receipt. In those first hours after being escorted out, I felt hollow, like 9 years of work had vanished with a single signature. But when the dust settled, I saw something I had never allowed myself to see clearly. Every late-night note I kept, every time-stamped entry, every folder of documentation I maintained was not a burden. It was power, real power, the kind that doesn't shout or demand attention but waits, steady and patient, until the moment you finally need it. That realization didn't erase the hurt or the humiliation, but it did shift the ground beneath me. Solara believed my silence meant weakness. They mistook quiet work for compliance. What they never understood, and what I had to learn myself, is that being underestimated is often the perfect cover for preparing your own escape route. And when the time came, I didn't have to invent anything. I simply had to open the files I'd carried with me for years. The truth was already there, waiting to be used. If there's one thing I want someone my age to take from this, it's that you should never apologize for being thorough. Documentation isn't tedious, it's protection. Patience isn't passivity, it's strategy. And keeping receipts, literal or figurative, is sometimes the only thing that keeps power balanced when people in charge lose sight of fairness. How to get started today. Save your work in a place only you control. Keep a simple log of what you create and when. Document conversations that feel off. Don't rely on memory. Write everything down. Protect your boundaries as fiercely as your time. Have you ever discovered strength you didn't know you had until someone pushed you too far?